Hello, my favorite listener. Welcome back into the dark of the woods. It must be Friday. This is Hermit of the Pines, episode 4. As always, Into the Dark of the Woods is a Rust Belt Studio production. And we have the two other shows, if you haven't found them already, Mikey and the Garden Arch and The Engine of War. They run on opposite Tuesdays, so a new show drops every Tuesday depending on who you're listening to. Speaking of listening, sharing, and liking are all great ways to move us forward. If you'd like to support the studio in other ways, there are links in the show notes below. Now settle in. The show is about to start. The cave hadn't given them answers, only shelter. A dark hole in the hill, damp and empty, that let them survive the night. They had half believed something would be waiting inside, bones, symbols, proof of the hermit, but the stone gave them nothing except a roof. When dawn came gray and merciless, they decided the trip was finished. No more notes, no more footage. They were bugging out. 22.5 miles stood between them and the car. On the map, it looked easy, a casual hike. On the ground, it felt like punishment. Snow had been falling steady since they left the cave, fresh weight over the old drifts. The hermit's tracks, what they had been following until now, were already softening, edges collapsing, sometimes vanishing outright where the wind brushed them away. Each time Jonah spotted a print, he felt relief and dread all at the same time. The man had walked this way. The man had left them. Riley carried the GPS in her mittened hand, and every time the screen lit, the numbers mocked her. 0.6 miles gained in nearly an hour. A pace so slow the machine seemed offended. The arrow blinked like a judgmental eye. You're failing. You're crawling. You will never get there. She snapped it shut, then opened it again minutes later, hoping the math would change. It never did. The hike turned into a trudge measured in body parts, shoulders aching under straps, hips rubbed raw beneath belts, thighs on fire, calves knotting, breath rasping like sandpaper. Casey bent forward, camera stuffed under his coat now, the strap cutting into his neck. Riley leaned sideways with every other step as if bracing herself against an invisible hand. Jonah wrote nothing. His notebook stayed zipped away. Survival didn't leave room for observation. They weren't exploring anymore. They weren't filming a story. At this point, they were just trying to leave these woods alive. The storm thickened until the woods had no edges. Trees turned into smudges, then vanished into the wall of white. Snow didn't fall in flakes anymore, but in curtains, each gust dragging a sheet across their faces. Breathing was work. Air scraped at the throat, burned cold in the lungs. Riley would use the GPS to recalibrate and recalculate their path, the glow of the screen painting her face that emerald green. Each time she checked, the numbers crept forward by decimals, never full miles. Each time she turned them, realigned them, she was certain that this would get them there faster. She hated the flashing dot with its crawling movement. The woods around them shifted, erased, remade with every gust, but the screen never doubted itself. She still imagined it scolding them. You've moved only 0.2. You should be further. You should be better. She'd snap it shut, then open it again because the silence without numbers was worse. Jonah fell behind and finally dragged a pencil stub across his notebook, words turning jagged as he walked. Snow depth at thigh. Visibility less than 30 feet. Morale low. He wrote low twice as if repetition made it more true. Casey huffed steam into the scarf that iced over his mouth. His pack straps dug trenches into his coat. He gave up wiping the lens. The camera hung useless, a pendulum that only recorded his stumbling gait. Once he raised it on instinct and caught only static white, a featureless frame that looked like death. He just let it fall again. Every 50 yards they paused, leaning against trees, lungs burning. No one spoke because speaking used heat, and heat was too expensive. The woods pressed closer with each pause. silent but not still, and Riley kept glancing at the GPS as if it were a judge she could not appease. By full afternoon, it wasn't just snowing again, it was as if the night had been plotting against them. The 3 feet that had fallen while they slept were multiplying before their very eyes. Every step sank them waist deep, then fought to keep them there. Pulling out of each hole was a climb, a lurch, a prayer that the next step would hold and not swallow them whole. Casey was leaning forward like a mule under harness, every stride ending with a grunt. He tried lifting his knees higher, punching through, but the snow clutched him like wet concrete. Jonah's notes blurred with snowflakes, pages gone soft and useless. He reread his lines. He underlined morale low so hard it nearly tore through the paper. The hopelessness grew heavier than the packs. They had left the cave to escape, but the woods had only redoubled the sentence. Each pause stretched longer. Each breath rasped louder, and when they moved again, it felt like the storm itself was laughing, shoving them back into the white where they'd already crossed. Eventually, they had to stop. It wasn't a decision they made so much as it was made for them. They would not make it out of this tonight. Jonah dropped first, leaning back against a pine that bent under the snow, his breath plumed up in ragged bursts. He unzipped the pocket with the GPS, remembered Riley had it, and then settled for staring at his useless notebook. Pages had gone limp, graphite blurred into gray smears. He thought of the word record and realized how badly he wanted to believe that this would be remembered by anyone. His glove pressed the cover shut, and Riley crouched a few dozen feet away, the GPS cupped like a candle in her hands. The numbers had only crept forward in cruel decimals, each one smaller than the ache in her legs. She felt like it was a trick. There was no way they still had a third of the way to go. They had been walking forever, or 7 hours by her watch, but 7 hours was about all of the daylight they got this time of year. Casey sagged last, pack sliding off his shoulders. He sat in the snow as though it were a chair and let the camera dangle from its strap. The lens fogged and cleared like it was breathing when he no longer wanted to. He raised it once more, pointed it at the endless wall of white, and still saw nothing but static. When he lowered it again, his throat made a sound that might have been laughter, might have been a sob. They weren't far apart. Riley could have touched Jonah's boot with a long step, and Casey could have tossed a stick and hit Riley's hood, but the storm separated them all the same. The snow hissed down between them, a white curtain that made each of them believe for a few minutes that they were alone in the woods. It was Riley who noticed him first. She had the GPS open, still glaring at the numbers she hated, when a shadow thickened on the edge of the storm. At first it looked like another tree swaying under snow, bent into a human shape by chance. Then it moved. The Hermit stepped out of the white the same way the snow did, without warning, without edges. One moment there was only the blur of woods, the next a figure threaded into it as if he'd always been there, waiting for them to see. The coat, still a patchwork of old fabrics, seemed like crisscrossing scars. Snow clung to the wool but never seemed to soak it through. The socks that they had left him were sodden gray, frozen, and yet the weight of them didn't really seem to matter. His hair hung in damp strands, framing a face too pale for someone who lived outdoors, even this time of year. He raised a hand, not to wave, not to greet, but to beckon. A curl of fingers, efficient, almost impatient. It wasn't a question, it was direction. Jonah straightened against his tree, every muscle arguing with the urge to obey. Casey half laughed under his breath, too ragged to mean it. "Are we really?" he began, but the rest of the question stuck in his throat. Riley was already on her feet. She nodded, sharp and certain, like a child agreeing to a parent's command. Jonah hauled himself the rest of the way, teeth clenched, then Casey last, slinging his pack with a groan. The Hermit turned and walked. His stride was steady, almost dainty, knees lifting just enough to clear the drifts that swallowed the students. Where their legs punched deep and left pits behind, his seemed carried on the surface, snow bracing him instead of resisting. He didn't look back often, once, twice, just long enough to confirm they were following, then forward again. Snow wrapped around him like a companion, erasing the tracks behind even as he made them. And they followed because not following meant dying where they stood. The walk after him felt as exhausting as it did necessary. Riley didn't even check to see if this was on the GPS path back to the car, her trust now absolutely with the figure in front of them, and her doneness with the accursed dot total. She kept her eye on the pale blur of his coat, terrified that if she blinked too long, the storm would erase him. Casey gave one last half-hearted effort to raise the camera, caught only a field of white static, and let it fall useless again. Jonah stayed close to his friends, mentally saving everything he would write and realizing it was just 2 more lines. He found us. He saved us. That last had more hope in it that made him feel good, but he walked on just the same. Then, as if the woods had blinked, the trees pulled back. A clearing stood where there shouldn't have been one, hollowed from the snow and rimmed with leaning pines. In its center sagged a structure, an old logging cabin, 3 walls fully intact. One had a hole that was now twice over the size of the window that had been there before. The roof bowed under the weight of the new snow, and the door was hanging from a single hinge. The ruin probably shouldn't have been standing, and yet it did, barely enough to count as a shelter, yet looked like the best thing the 3 had ever seen. The hermit stopped at the threshold. He didn't enter, he just hunched his shoulders against the wind, pale face turned aside, one hand on the doorframe. He was motioning them in, and all 3 thought he was playing more at gracious host than survival called for. Riley almost cried when she saw the stacked timber in the corner. Casey dropped his pack with a grunt, fumbling at zippers. Jonah noted the stone hearth, brushing soot from its blackened throat. "It'll work," he said, though his teeth clicked with cold. They coaxed a flame with shivering hands, striking sparks into tinder until smoke rose and the fire caught. Heat spread thinly, but any warmth was a reprieve. Riley held her palms over the flame until the sting gave way to feeling. Casey fed sticks, face orange in the glow. Jonah melted snow in a pan and passed it around, metallic, smoky water that tasted like survival. The hermit lingered just inside the broken wall, always in the shadow. He did not sit, did not reach toward the flame. His eyes slid to it, then away, as if warmth were a thing forbidden to him, or just unnecessary. Casey, desperate to bridge the silence, dug out a pack of sausage. He cut slices into the pan, and the grease spat and hissed, filling the air with a sharp, comforting scent. Jonah took over, hand stiff around the knife. It happened fast. His grip slipped, the blade skidded, and a bead of blood welled bright against his palm. A drop struck the floor, blooming red on old wood. The hermit instantly changed. He jerked upright, chest heaving, sleeve dragged across his mouth as if to hide from the smell. His breath rasped loud enough to drown the fire's crackle. His pale eyes locked on Jonah's hand, wide, horrified. "No," he rasped, harsh and broken, then again, softer, the word half swallowed. "No." He backed into the doorway, body folding against itself as though some unseen weight pressed him down. For a moment he stayed there, shadow against the storm. Then he turned sharply and pulled himself into the snow, vanishing as suddenly as he had come. His tracks began filling in before the wind even closed the door. Inside, Jonah pressed gauze to his hand while Riley wrapped it tight. The cut was shallow, bleeding already slowing, but none of them spoke. The only sound was the fire snapping too brightly in a silence that no longer belonged to them. Casey set the camera down, lens blind against the floor, and Riley glanced toward the door, snow spilling in, erasing everything the hermit had left behind. They built the fire larger than they meant to, afraid of what silence would sound like. Logs snapped and hissed, shadows bent long across the sagging roof. Smoke climbed the old chimney, but every now and then the wind shoved it back down, rolling gray through the ruin until their eyes watered. The hole in the wall and the loose door made warmth into a fragile thing. Heat pooled in pockets, never enough to fill the room. Sit too close and your face burned while your back froze. Step away and it was like falling back into the storm. They dragged their sleeping bags near the hearth and huddled shoulder to shoulder, yet drafts still found them, searching fingers sliding across their necks, ankles, wrists. Casey took the first watch. He propped himself by the doorway, hood drawn low, camera balanced on his knee. The lens pointed into the storm, though it could see nothing. He caught himself dozing more than once and snapped upright, convinced he'd missed the hermit's return, but nothing moved except the white. Riley woke after midnight to take her turn. She sat with the GPS in her lap, thumb rubbing the lid in circles. She didn't open it. She didn't want to see the distance still mocking them. She only listened. She listened to the fire breathing, to the storm's uneven rhythm, to the sounds in her own chest. Once she swore she heard a knock in the trees, 3 sharp beats carried between gusts. She stared until her eyes stung but saw nothing. She told herself it was a branch snapping under snow. Jonah took the last watch. He had barely slept anyway. Dreams had stalked him the moment he closed his eyes, dreams heavy as wet wool. He saw names burned into wood, each letter glowing, his own among them. He felt the hot nail pressed to his skin instead of the log, and he woke with a cry, muffled in his scarf, and sat up shaking. When the fire dipped low, he fed it with trembling hands. Once the flame guttered, shadows rose along the ruined wall, shapes too tall for the cabin, and then it recaught and relit. When the other 2 awoke, they found Jonah had fallen asleep on duty but didn't really chastise him, just shook him once to rouse him awake. The storm had passed overnight like a nightmare, but the memory of it, the fresh snow piled around them, remained. Reluctantly, Riley opened the GPS and found that the cabin hadn't led them too far astray, and that their car, most likely a buried mound on the side of the road, would be reachable today for certain. She rallied the boys together, and they set out to get home. Hello again. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Hermit of the Pines, a Rust Belt Studio production. This episode was written and performed by Bryan Foster. Rust Belt Studio is also proud to bring you 2 other shows, Mikey and the Garden Arch and The Engine of War. One, a high fantasy hero quest. The other, a low fantasy gritty moral drama. Both are done every Tuesday opposite each other. If you'd like to support the studio, the listens do help. Liking helps as well. Sharing it with someone who might be interested goes a very long way. But if you'd like to do more to help us move forward, you can join our Patreon, and the link is in the show notes below. At the $2 grip level, you will get 1-day early access and ad-free episodes from all of our major shows. If you'd like to move up to the $5 projectionist level, that'll get you in the booth. There, you'll get once-a-month featurettes, as well as other bonus content that we put out specifically for our patrons. At $9, you become an executive producer, and you can help shape the studio. Either way, thank you very much for being here, and until next time, my favorite listener.